Hello, everyone, and thank you for accessing the resource I have prepared. My name is Peter de Guzman, and as part of one of the requirements of my managerial accounting class, I am here to talk about my firm's cost system or costing system. The firm I have selected is an automotive dealership. And I say automotive dealership because I want to stay away from the brand as much as possible and actually focus on the functions or the functionality of a typical business entity within this industry, as that is what I believe matters more. And this transitions us to the next slide. The two major firms in the automotive industry. There are two classifications or categories of firms in the automotive industry. And for the sake of this discussion, it is essential right at the very beginning to distinguish which automotive firm is being discussed. Because each of these two firms functions very differently. Although they work hand in hand, they possess different qualities and they operate in different ways. The first classification is the importer. The importer in an automotive industry coordinates with the manufacturing plants of the automotive company. Think of brands such as Volkswagen or Honda, Toyota, Mitsubishi, Ford, and so on to order a certain quantity of vehicles to be sold locally or to be sold here in the Philippines. So, an importer essentially orders vehicles overseas in order to bring them here. And once these units are here, they are then sold to what we know as the automotive dealership or the car dealership. Now, this is the second classification. A car dealership or an automotive dealership serves as the primary and arguably the only touch point of prospective car buyers to view, test drive, and hopefully purchase a vehicle. So we have the importer and we have the dealership. For this discussion, for an analysis of the costing system of the firm, we will be focusing mainly rather on a car dealership. And in a car dealership, this is the typical purchase process to expect. There are a lot of activities, engagements, and time devoted involved in a typical purchase process. But for the sake of simplification, we can actually divide the entire story of a vehicle purchase into three segments. Segment number one, the client visits the dealership to view available vehicle models. Segment number two, the client and sales consultant discuss and eventually finalize the financing or the payment options. Segment Number three, or segment C, is the consultant turns over the vehicle to the client. Now, there's discussion about after sales that I did not include in this scenario. Let's just limit this presentation to client visits the showroom, client negotiates with the sales consultant, and sales consultant then hands over the vehicle to the client. Excuse me for that. Okay, moving on. In providing the costing system, we have to understand who are involved in the entire transaction process from the moment the customer enters the showroom to the moment the customer receives the keys to his or her brand new vehicle. So these are the three individuals who are directly responsible for the completion of the sale and subsequent turnover of a purchased vehicle. First, we have the car preparation specialist. The car preparation specialist is not necessarily an engineer, probably closer to a technician or a specialist. This is the individual who makes sure that every nook and cranny, every detail of the vehicle is up to standard, that the vehicle is clean, that the vehicle has complete accessories, the manuals, the add-ons, if any, the fuel level of the vehicle. There's a standard set fuel level for a vehicle that is about to be released, of course, and so many other aspects and so many other tiny details. This is taken care of by the car preparation specialist, the state of the vehicle. Now, when it comes to the associated costs, expenses, and potential analysis of profit or profitability of the transaction, we have to rely on the finance associate. The finance associate works hand in hand with the sales consultant to encode numerous data, data points, figures, and costs into the system or into the database. Our database is called ADAMS. And ADAM stands for Automotive Database Management System. So this is where most associates, most employees input the relevant data. So it is the job of the finance associate to make sure that all the numbers that are encoded are accurate and representative of the associated costs of the transaction. The final and probably the most important customer facing role is that of a sales consultant. So I used to be a sales consultant, so this is my forte among the three roles that are being presented right now. What does a sales consultant do? Sales consultant does a lot of things. The sales consultant is the primary spokesperson, so to speak, of the company. The sales consultant is supposed to be well versed in details, specification, and information regarding both the company and the vehicle of interest. And the sales consultant, as mentioned earlier, also has to work hand in hand with the finance associate to get the accurate numbers down so that once the expenses, the charges, and the costs are analyzed, then the data is accurate. The sales consultant finally will also be in charge of turning over the vehicle to the client. So, let's just paint the picture a little bit more. We have discussed the three general segments of the timeline of the vehicle purchase. We have also discussed the three key employees or three internal roles that matter in the costing analysis or the costing system analysis. And now it is time to talk about what, to my understanding, the most applicable costing system is in this firm and in this scenario. So remember, what we are taking a look at is how a vehicle that is purchased by a client can incur specific costs. So keep this in mind as I attempt to justify why this is the costing system that is most applicable. Keep in mind that when a client orders a vehicle, there are several options. There are several add-ons. There's a certain customizability to the purchase. And there is a certain realm of differentiation in expenses or even expected income depending on the type of financing or payment option selected by the client. So keep these aspects in mind, and we shall now move on to the costing system that I feel is most applicable to this firm, to an automotive dealership. What I believe to be the most appropriate costing system to use in this specific instance is job order costing. There are three main reasons why. Reason number one, vehicle purchases are varied. There is no one size fits all approach to each and every car buyer. There is a client who would want their cars waxed beforehand. There's a client who wants tint applied or tint installed, and so on and so forth. Reason number two, job order costing, the system involved, determines the profitability per mode of payment. And reason number three, the profitability per model. There are a vast array of vehicles, sedans, SUVs, vans in a given vehicle lineup for any given brand for that matter. And this is why job order costing is the more appropriate or the most appropriate costing system. An argument could be made for traditional costing, and perhaps activity based costing could also be applied. Process costing would probably be more appropriate for the manufacturer side or even the importer side. But as far as we're concerned, the scope of this discussion will be limited to job order costing for the reasons I have already mentioned. Okay, let's go through the reasons one by one. Let's go a bit in depth on them. So reason number one, I said vehicle purchases are varied. There is a great element of customizability in buying a car. The variety stems from any combination of the following factors: mode of payment, vehicle model, add-on services, accessories, insurance provider, applicable discounts, and other factors. There are several items, there are several circumstances, and there are several services even that could affect the overall price or the overall cost of the vehicle to be sold to a client. And this is why the variety calls for costing system that is specific to each transaction so that comparisons can be made in between the transactions, and possibly even trends could be obtained from clusters of transactions, so to speak. Reason number two, profitability per mode of payment. There are three common ways of purchasing a vehicle, just as it is with purchasing a piece of real estate property or even purchasing movie tickets, buying food. There are multiple methods. When it comes to car buying specifically, there are three mainly used methods. Number one is the straight cash payment, in which the client either tenders cold cash or a manager's check or cashier's check, if you will. The second option is bank financing. This is where this happens when the client transacts directly with the bank and the bank issues the purchase order to the car dealership to finalize the sale of the vehicle. The third option is the most costly option if we're looking at all expenses, the most costly for the client. This is what is known as in-house financing. Instead of the client going to the bank to transact for a financing transaction, the client goes to the dealership to enter into an in-house financing transaction. The contrast between bank financing and in-house financing, aside from the fact that the client approaches the bank for bank financing and the client approaches the dealership for in-house financing, is that the interest is significantly higher for in-house financing. The reasoning behind this significantly higher interest rate is because you would be essentially treating the dealership as a one-stop shop for everything. You apply, you obtain a loan, you get the car, you ask for assistance, all of which are done through the dealership, through the dealership's efforts and through the dealership's resources and manpower. This is why interest is higher for in-house financing. Moving on, profitability per model. Obviously, models vary in terms of cost. The primary factors that affect the variety of pricing are as follows. I'm sorry, excuse me. The vehicle segment, the vehicle could be an SUV, a compact SUV, mid-size SUV, full-size SUV. Could also be a sedan, subcompact sedan, compact sedan, full-size sedan, a van, even a truck, a pickup truck, an AUV. There's so many different vehicle segments, and the segment to which the vehicle belongs to can largely affect its pricing and its associated costs. Next is the place of origin. Of course, if you order or import a vehicle from Germany, which is so far away, then the logistics costs, the tariffs or the transport taxes associated and the import taxes will be much higher compared to, say, for example, importing from China, in which China and the Philippines have certain trade agreements or tariff reduction agreements that allows the costs to be marginally lower compared to European countries, for example. Next is variant or trim. We have the base model, the mid-level, the high-end model, the sports edition model, the limited edition model. There's so many variations of a model, and this definitely affects the associated costs, both direct and indirect. Next is the engine size and power, as well as other technical aspects. So, things such as horsepower rating, torque, fuel efficiency, these aspects are governed by the state of technology and the quality of components that make a specific car or make a specific vehicle. So, all of these five factors contribute to the profitability per model vis-a-vis the price tag that is placed on it by the dealer at the end of the day. Now, we're creeping a bit closer toward the costing system and why job order costing is the appropriate system. It is now time that we discuss or talk about the three key aspects or the three key categories that will be seen in a job order form or job order costing form: the direct materials, the direct labor, and the manufacturing overhead or the MOH. Let's begin with the direct materials. In the context of this industry, in the context of this firm, the materials involved aren't materials, raw materials per se. These are actually the costs of the vehicle itself, any add-on services, and any accessories. So this is what our material section is going to be composed of. Items related to any of the three aspects I just mentioned. Next, we have the cost of direct labor hours of the car preparation specialist, the finance associate, and the sales consultant as the direct labor cost. Remember, in the introduction to this presentation, I already talked about the three key employees. And once again, we find them here as cost items in terms of direct labor hours. Last but definitely not least, we have the manufacturing overhead. These are the indirect costs associated with the transaction or the sale of a vehicle. It is expressed as a rate that is based on or driven by direct labor hours. As has already been discussed in class, by the book, and by certain guide videos, this manufacturing overhead, the rate indicated here is merely an approximation, as we would not truly know the exact figures until the end of the period, which is typically a financial year, which is typically 12 months. Moving on. Okay, we now arrive at certain examples. And just to give context, let's take a look at three customers. We have customer Alpha, we have customer Beta, and we have customer Charlie. We'll be going back and forth through the slides. Let's try to compare certain line items just so we have a flavor or a better context of how a job cost sheet operates or how a job cost sheet expresses values. So, once again, we have alpha, beta, and Charlie. Okay, let's take a look at the job cost sheet of customer alpha. We can see here that everything is pretty much straightforward, self explanatory. But let's take a look at certain items. Let's move to direct materials first. Under direct materials, the first item we see is model. And we have its corresponding units or quantity. We also have the corresponding price and we have the amount. The amount is essentially a product of the price and the number of units availed of for the transaction. Okay, according to this job cost sheet, customer Alpha purchased a Santana and the cost or the associated price is 500,000 pesos. And to get the amount, we multiply, as I mentioned earlier, 500,000 pesos by 1. Because only one Santana was purchased. So we get 500,000 pesos. Okay? So Alpha purchased the Santana, which is a type of sedan, which is a sedan model. Let's take a look at Beta. Beta, under direct materials, under model, purchased a Lavida. And as we can see, the price of the Lavida is 1 million pesos. Exactly twice the amount of a Santana. So Beta purchased a vehicle that is twice the cost of a Santana. Charlie, on the other hand, purchased a Tiguan. A Tiguan, as opposed to a Santana and a Lavida, is an SUV. So it is expected that the price or the cost point is higher. The Tiguan's associated price or cost is 1.5 million pesos. Alpha purchased Santana at 500,000 pesos. Beta purchased the Lavida at 1 million pesos. And Charlie purchased a Tiguan at 1.5 million pesos. Okay, now we take a look at the add-on services. First item under this section, subsection, is tint. And it says per panel. This is because in the automotive industry, not for all firms, but for certain firms, the tint application, the costing of which is based on how many glass panels of the vehicle need to be tinted. So if we take a look at this example right here, customer Alpha has six of the panels of his Santana tinted. Why six? We have the front windshield, the four windows, of course, and the rear windshield. So 1 plus 4 plus 1, that's 6. 6 panels were installed with tint at a price of 500 pesos per panel installation. We end up with an amount of 3,000 pesos. So that's how it goes. Let's take a look at customer beta. Still looking at tint per panel as always. And we see here that the number of units is 3 as compared to 6. Why is this the case? This is the case because there are certain clients that do not want all of the panels tinted. Some clients, such as customer beta, would just like 3 panels tinted. That would be the front windshield typically and the 2 front windows for a total of 3 panels. 3 times 500 is 1,500. Now, let's move on to customer Charlie. Taking a look at tint once again. We can see here, number of units is half or zero point 0.5. How is this possible? This is possible because there are certain scenarios wherein a client would only want the top half of his or her front windshield tinted. This way, he or she could avail of the protection, the UV ray protection offered by the tint without sacrificing much of the visibility while driving. This is helpful during the night because at night tint is virtually, I would say, useless. I guess it could be said that tint is useless at night because it just significantly affects visibility, but that would depend on the shade of tint, of course, light, medium, heavy, or dark. So since we have point 0.5, we have half a unit and the price is 500, our ending amount is 250. Next, let's go back to customer alpha and take a look at wax. By hand, hand waxing is significantly cheaper than machine waxing, but probably the shiny effect would still last a couple of weeks. So the quality offered by hand waxing is still okay, but it's not as good as machine waxing. So for customer alpha who ordered the Santana, hand waxing cost him 2,000 pesos. Let's take a look at customer beta's hand waxing cost. See here, now it's by machine. And as opposed to 2,000 pesos if the waxing is done by hand, we now have a 5,000 peso charge. Customer Charlie also had machine waxing done. That's 5,000 pesos to add on to the list of costs. So we're working our way line by line. Let's go back to alpha again. Ceramic coating. In ceramic coating, there are actually a lot of providers of ceramic coating, a lot of brands involved, and a lot of technicians. So charges vary. But for the sake of this example, let's simplify it to two categories: basic ceramic coating and premium ceramic coating. For the customer, for customer alpha who purchased the Santana, he availed of basic ceramic coating, which amounted to 4,000 pesos. Let's take a look at what Beta and Charlie did. Okay, so here, customer Beta availed of premium ceramic coating at 7,500 pesos, and customer Charlie did the same, availing of premium ceramic coating at 7,500 pesos. With that, we now move on to accessories. Let's go back to Alpha. We see here standard tools, standard umbrella, standard manual, standard service booklet, all with their corresponding quantities and their corresponding costs. As we can all see here, it is important to take note of the term standard. This means, especially in the automotive industry, a standard item means that the item is part of the package or is part of the purchase. So, while these four items specifically may be free on the customer side, it still comes at a cost or a corresponding price for the firm, or in this case, for the automotive dealership. Tools around 2,000, umbrella 300, manual 150, service booklet 150. Customer beta, on the other hand, on top of receiving the standard items, the standard accessories, he or she also availed of a car charger and a sunshade accessory as additional protection from the sun. These amounted to 250 pesos and 300 pesos respectively. Let's take a look at what Charlie did. Okay, so Charlie also availed of the charger. Charlie also availed of sunshade. On top of that, we could also include his merchandise purchases as part of the entirety of the purchase package. We can see here that Charlie purchased not just a cap but also a jacket. The cap is priced at 250 pesos. The jacket is priced at 1,500 pesos, further raising the costs associated with this transaction. And that now ends our total direct materials cost. For Alpha, it's around 511,000. For Beta, it's 1,017,150. For Charlie, it's 1,517,000 and a couple of hundreds. Oh, what can be obtained from the direct materials section? In the automotive industry, the price of the model is the largest determinant of the costs associated with direct materials. However, it would also serve companies and decision makers to identify the additional or the supplementary items that were availed of other than the car itself. Add-on services and accessories all tallied for a few thousands more pesos for customer alpha, For customer beta, we see that here, and also for customer Charlie. So, let's just take a look at Charlie for a bit. The Tiguan is 1.5 million, but the bottom line direct materials cost is 1.517650. This means that an additional 17,650 pesos was added to the cost of the vehicle for the transaction to materialize. So imagine if companies were as particular and as detailed as this, then they would be able to determine which cost items need to be reviewed or assessed. So we'll talk more about that later. Let's go back to customer alpha and take a look at direct labor. Okay. Oh, the rate of labor, direct labor per hour is an estimation. So this isn't the actual figures, the actual figure of the car preparation specialist, the finance associate, and the sales consultant. These are just approximations or estimates just for the sake of providing examples. So, direct labor. Car preparation specialist takes 6 hours for the Santana model of customer alpha. Let's take a look at customer beta. For the La Vida, it took the car preparation specialist 8 hours. So he had to take up a couple more hours for the service to be done. And let's take a look at customer Charlie. The Tiguan, once again, is an SUV. So this is probably why the car preparation specialist needed 10 direct labor hours to accomplish the preparation of the vehicle. Let's now go back to Alpha and take a look at the finance associate. So this is something interesting that I wanted to show to the viewers, just so we have a better context of why the variety is there for the finance associate specifically. So, customer alpha, the finance associate required 4 direct labor hours to accomplish the transaction. For customer beta, it also took 4 direct labor hours. And finally, for customer Charlie, it only took 2 labor hours. So take note of that. Why is it that the cheap, let's not use cheap, the more affordable units required more hours from the finance associate? The Santana required 4, the La Vida required 4, but the Tiguan only required 2 hours. So what happened here, and why is this the case? Well, if you recall, in one of my discussion points earlier, I mentioned that there are 3 modes of payment: straight cash, bank financing, and in house financing. In the automotive industry, straight cash payments are the most straightforward transactions that could ever be done. This means that all related encoding, data encoding, coordination with other departments are significantly reduced when the buyer is willing to pay in cash. So, based off of that logic, maybe customer Charlie only required 2 direct labor hours from the finance associate because he purchased the Tiguan in cash. This is in contrast to customer beta and customer alpha who required 4 hours, 4 direct labor hours to accomplish the transaction. All right. So now we move on to the sales consultant and the number of direct labor hours. Sales consultant for customer alpha took a total of 14 hours. So can you imagine the number of hours the sales consultant put into this transaction is greater than the sum of both the car preparation specialist and the finance associate. Why is this the case? Because in accounting for the direct labor hours of a sales consultant, every involved activity has to be included. This is from the first point of contact And this should include any text messages, email exchanges, phone calls, video conference calls if required, and future visits for test driving, for contract discussion and contract negotiation, and so on and so forth. So this is probably why it took this sales consultant 14 hours for customer alpha. For customer beta, it only took the sales consultant 6 direct labor hours to accomplish the transaction. So it could probably be said, or it could be theorized here, that the sales consultant had an easier and more efficient time with customer beta in handling the transaction. Perhaps customer beta was more decisive, or perhaps customer beta was in a rush to complete everything, or perhaps customer beta did not even test drive the vehicle, which consumes a lot of direct labor hours on the part of the sales consultant. Let's take a look at customer Charlie. Oh, so as we see here, it only took the sales consultant 2 hours to complete the transaction with customer Charlie. Why just 2 hours? Well, it could be said that perhaps the client had the cash on hand, and the client was fully decided as to which vehicle he was planning to buy. So he probably arrived at the dealership, handed the cash, or maybe manager's check, and waited for the confirmation of the validity of the check, for the check to clear, basically. And the sales consultant probably discussed certain terms and conditions, and probably oriented customer Charlie about the ins and outs of the vehicle. And that's essentially 2 hours, 2 direct labor hours for the sales consultant. And then there are corresponding costs associated. This is multiplied, this is per hour, and then we multiply it to the number of units. And then we get the corresponding total direct labor cost for each customer, Alpha, Beta, and Charlie. So we now move on to the manufacturing overhead cost. Again, as mentioned earlier, the manufacturing overhead cost is more of an estimate, an approximation, probably based on historical data, or probably based on projections. Now, this is not an exact amount, but it helps decision makers within the firm paint a better picture of the costs associated with manufacturing overhead, vis-a-vis or in relation to what drives the manufacturing overhead. For the sake of simplifying this example, the decision was made to use direct labor hours, because this is data that is already, already readily available and obtainable from the direct labor hours section right above, comprised of the direct labor hours of the car preparation specialist, the finance associate, and the sales consultant. So we keep moving on. We have 24 here for customer alpha. This is the sum of 6, 4, and 14, which are the three direct labor hour quantities of the three important employees in the transaction. And the price, the corresponding price, is 1,500 pesos. This is an arbitrary amount for the sake of having an example. The cost could be far greater, the cost could be far less, or the cost could be right on the money. But for the sake of this example, let us use 1,500 pesos per direct labor hour as our working rate. We end up with 36,000 pesos for customer alpha. For customer beta, we get 27,000 pesos. And for customer Charlie, we get 21,000 pesos. So, this and the other two customers have job cost sheets. And as we can see, everything is specific, everything flows freely, and there are insights or stories to be obtained. Sorry, excuse me, from each job cost sheet. And this is why the job costing system is such a valuable tool for any firm, particularly the automotive dealership firm. As for insights obtained, there are already several. And as we were working through the problems, or as we were working through the examples, there were several to be talked about, to be discussed. But for the sake of encapsulating the entire discussion, or for providing a summary for the job costing system, the system selected, let's talk about three important insights. Insight number one: job costing allows us to identify and itemize costs for each transaction. I'd also like to add that job costing allows us to cordon off, or to group, or to section certain types of transactions in order for us to determine what that cost item is associated with. So the picture I decided to use for this description, or for insight number one, is a picture of trays of condiments, toppings for, I believe this is like in Subway, I guess. Different toppings. We see mushrooms, onions, cucumbers, corn, eggs, and so on and so forth. This could even be toppings for salads. So whatever these toppings may be for, essentially what this picture is trying to show is that everything is sorted out and everything is organized. So when we have a decision maker who is familiar with the costing system look into job cost sheets, then he or she would easily and conveniently be able to identify the different cost items and where they fall under in terms of the cost classification, whether it be direct materials, whether it be direct labor, or as part of indirect costs as calculated through the manufacturing overhead rate. Insight number two: this system allows us to determine the proficiency, efficiency, and profitability of employees. There are multiple end of year awards given for sales consultants specifically. And one of the best ways to measure how good a sales consultant was is to determine the profitability of each transaction. Was there a greater profit margin when a car was sold to customer Alpha by sales consultant A? Or was it more profitable for sales consultant B to sell a car to customer Charlie, for example? So these are the types of things that can be looked into in order to recognize employees and in order to measure employee performance. Of course, this is not supposed to be the end all be all indicator. There are other factors such as perhaps team spirit, morale, attitude, attendance, and so on. But this is a very good objective, quantitative measure of how good an employee has been performing. Finally, the job costing system allows us to determine cost items that need to be reviewed or analyzed. So let's take a look here. I think what's important to take a look at is the standard items. As I mentioned earlier, standard items are accessories that come with the vehicle but have their own separate costs, have their own associated costs. So we look at the tools. Is there any way for the tools to be reduced to 1,500? Is that plausible? Is that safe still? Will the tools still be effective? Will they be long lasting? How about the umbrella? Is a typical umbrella really supposed to cost 300 pesos for the firm? Would it help perhaps if we bought the umbrellas in bulk? Would it help perhaps if we entered a trade association rather that would allow a representative, a collective identity to purchase millions of umbrellas, for example, at significantly lower costs? So maybe we could lower 300 pesos to 275, to 260, maybe even to 250. if the quantity is right or if the bulk order is right. And the same goes for the standard manual and the standard service booklet. Would it be more efficient to perhaps provide a digital copy so that there is lesser carbon footprint and lesser costs associated? Or is it still worthwhile to produce physical copies of both the manual and the service booklet? So, because of this job cost sheet and the job costing system overall, we would be able to review certain items that may not have necessarily been part of the scope of analysis because they were simply items that were not put to the spotlight, so to speak. So it's very, very effective. It's very good. And this is a highly recommended costing approach for the automotive dealership because of the different types of transactions, the varieties, whether they be slight or whether they be significant, and the itemized costs. Of course, probably one of the more challenging aspects of a job cost sheet would be the manufacturing overhead cost because there is sorry, there's no way to precisely determine the correct rate. And it may not even be the case that there's only one driver. There may be multiple drivers, and there may be a formula that needs to be formulated or created or developed in order to accurately determine the manufacturing overhead costs. But nevertheless, we would like to end on a high note by saying that the job costing method, the direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead, the relative simplicity of creating the job cost sheet, as well as the major insights obtained, as just discussed, really exemplify why such a costing system is really helpful for decision makers. And hopefully I've made some great points and provided valuable insights. As I now end my presentation, thank you very much for listening and have a great day.